Opening prayer. Stop within the circle of time called Sabbath. Set aside your responsibilities. They will wait. Abide with the Lord of the Sabbath and learn how to let go. Amen.
All right, we're going to start with another Sabbath journal time, about 4 or 5 minutes. And this time I have a song for you by Carrie Newcomer that's titled Sanctuary.
I love that.
Will you be my refuge, my haven in the storm? Will you keep the embers warm when my fire's all but gone? Will you remember and bring me sprigs of rosemary? Be my sanctuary till I can carry on, carry on. Carry on. This one knocked me to the ground. This one dropped me to my knees. I should have seen it coming, but it surprised me. Will you be my refuge, my haven in the storm? Will you keep the embers warm when my fire's all but gone? Will you remember and bring me sprigs of rosemary? Be my sanctuary till I can carry on, carry on, carry on. In a state of true believers, on streets called us and them, it's gonna take some time till the world feels safe again. Will you be my refuge, my haven in the storm? Will you keep the embers warm when my fire's all but gone? Will you remember and bring me sprigs of rosemary? Be my sanctuary till I can carry on, carry on, carry on. You can rest here in Brown Chapel or with a circle of friends, a quiet grove of trees or between two bookends. Will you be my refuge, my haven in the storm? Will you keep the embers warm when my fire's all but gone? Will you remember and bring me sprigs of rosemary? Be my sanctuary till I can carry on, carry on, carry on, carry on.
All right.
Here I'm looking.
Good thing only 11 of you showed up because I only printed 12. Our scripture for today is the whole 16th chapter
Thank you.
of Exodus. And since it's, they don't print it in the,
Yeah, there's.
don't print it in the book, I thought you would like to read along, because what we're gonna do is basically go through the chapter and just point out some specific things, but I didn't want you to miss any of it, so you can follow along if you wish, as I just read through and pick out some of the highlights and call attention to them. But the lesson for today is called Sabbath and Surrender. So when I read that, first thing I thought of was, well, what is the object of surrender? To what or whom are we surrendering? And it turns out it's very clear early on, because the author of the study says that we are being asked to surrender to our sociocultural pursuit of enough and to the divine gift of trust. We are asked to trust God. So the story of manna in the 16th chapter of Exodus is the only scripture for that. And so this is the story of manna and the quest for enough. So I'm just going to run through the story, hit the highlights, and then share one thing with you at the end, because I'm getting through all 36 verses and paying attention to all the significant parts that happen in there. I mean, that's a lesson in and of itself. So the story starts out by saying that the whole congregation, that is the whole nation of what would eventually become Israel, at this time they were simply Egyptian slaves that had left Egypt. They set out from Elim and they went to the wilderness of Sin. I thought that's an interesting English occurrence for the word sin to be there, but it literally means either thorn, which is not a good thing, or clay. But really it's just identified as the place between Elim and Sinai. And we know of Sinai because that comes up later. But the author tells us that this is the 15th day of the second month after they had departed. So just basically 45 days they've been gone from Egypt. Okay. This is very early on. And what happens? The whole congregation complained against Moses and Aaron. Of course, Moses and Aaron, they're the ones responsible. They're the ones that talked them into leaving, Well, Miriam had something to do with that, but we're not going to blame her. So they had these memories only after 45 days of this imaginary life that they had in Egypt. We sat in pots of meat and ate our fill of bread. You really think that happened? I'm not so sure. And then you brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Pretty straightforward complaint here. We're hungry. I'm hungry, Mom. What is there to eat? Well, no fast food places, no Pizza Hut to deliver or Papa John's or anything like that. Yeah, food's an important thing. So then God speaks to Moses and he's very clear and he says, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you each day. And he explains that people go out and gather enough for that day. That's an important thing. Go out and gather enough for that day. And he says, in that way, I will test them to see whether or not they're going to follow my instructions. Well, we know how that goes, but here it goes. And he also says on the sixth day, that is the day before, as they prepare for the Sabbath, what they bring in will be twice as much, so they won't have to go out on the Sabbath and gather. And so Moses and Aaron explained that all to them. And he said, in the evening, you're going to know that it was the Lord that brought you out of the land of Egypt, because you're going to have some food. And in the morning, he said, you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he, that is God, has heard your complaining. God knows who's complaining against. It's not Moses and Aaron, it's against God. And so Aaron said, for what are we that you complain against us? Because we're just doing what God told us to do. And so, Moses went on and said, when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because God's heard you complaining, your complaining is not against us, but against the Lord. And so then Moses told Aaron, who was more of the spokesperson, he said, say to the whole congregation, draw near to the Lord, for he has heard your complaining. So as they looked toward the wilderness, when he said this to them, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud, which I would assume would be some sort of bright light that they could recognize as not being a typical thing. And then the Lord goes back and speaks privately to Moses and says, at twilight you shall eat meat. So meat for the evening meal, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. Then you and the people shall know that I am the Lord your God. So story says, in the evening, quails came up and covered the ground. So easy enough to just walk out and grab all the quail you wanted, go back, prepare them. Good meal. All right. And then he says, in the morning, there was a layer of dew there on the surface, and a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost, that was on the ground. And that is what's going to turn into the bread. And the story says, when the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, what is it? The Hebrew is two words, manhu, which literally means what is it? And that's where the word manna comes from, because they didn't know what it was. I can't help but think of times when children have had food set before them and they said, I don't like this. What is this? You know, never even tried it, but they don't know what it is. It's not what they wanted. What is this? So it says, Moses said to them, this is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. You know what the Hebrew word for bread is? Lahem, as in Bethlehem. So what does Bethlehem mean? Hold on a minute. Bethlehem means house of bread.
Oh,
And where was Jesus born?
in the house of bread.
Bethlehem, right? So there you go. They knew that was going to be the house of bread before he was even born there. So this is the bread that the Lord has given you. And story goes on. Gather, this is the Lord commanded, gather as much as each of you needs, an omer per person according to the number of persons in your household. So if you had 3 in your household, 3 omers. If there were just 2 of you, 2. If you had 5, 5. We don't measure by omers anymore, but rough translation, it's something about a volume of a gallon, not quite. Or if it was weight, maybe 3.5 pounds or so. So a big old pile. I have always said that the description of this stuff reminds me of grits. A lot of people don't like grits. You know, of course, this was sweet. This is sweet grits. I don't put any sugar in mine, but anyway. So the story says they gathered some. Some gathered more, some gathered less. But when they got home and measured it, guess what? They all had an omer for each person. So no matter what they thought they were gathering, there was enough. As much as each one of them needed. And then the instructions were very clear. Don't leave any leftovers for in the morning. No refrigerators in the wilderness. But guess what? They didn't listen again. So some of them saved some for the morning, just in case there's not any there tomorrow. And when they woke up, it was rotten and had worms in it. That would make it taste even better when you went out and collected more of it the next day, wouldn't it? You was digging through looking for those worms in that rock. And the story says Moses was angry with them. But it also says that if they didn't gather it in the morning, it would be gone because it sort of melted when the sun came out. So really was some sort of frosty type kind of thing that tasted like honey. So then this first 6th day came and they gathered twice as much. And the Lord commanded them, tomorrow is your Sabbath, a day of holy rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. So do all your baking and boiling of what you want for tomorrow, today, and save it. Leave it aside and keep it till the morning. And guess what? On the Sabbath morning, no worms and no rot. It was available for them to eat all day long. So they put it aside and it didn't rot. And Moses said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Well, that was the first time they observed the Sabbath in this way, by collecting the manna, double amount on day 6, not collecting on day 7 and not cooking on day 7 because they cooked it on day 6 when they had collected it. But guess what happened on the 7th day? Some of them went back outside looking for some, and it wasn't there. Didn't need to be there because they already had it. They had what they needed. And here is where the Lord responds in some ways a lot like Moses did. How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and instructions? Because they didn't listen to much of anything he said. They collected more or less than they were told. They tried to save some of it during the week for the next day. And then some of them went out on the 7th day looking for some when they didn't need it. And so here's where one of the early descriptions of the Sabbath. On the 6th day, you're going to get food for 2 days. Stay where you are. Do not leave your place on the 7th day. It's not necessary, and it interferes with your participation in the Sabbath to the Lord. So finally, they learned to rest on the 7th day. And then we get a description of what it was. It looked like white coriander seed, and it tasted like wafers made with honey. Sounds pretty good. So then they decided that they wanted to keep an omer of it in the museum of some sorts. So they saved a jar of manna with an omer and placed it before the Lord to be kept throughout the generations. And there's some story later on where it says that was one of the things that was in the Ark of the Covenant, a jar of manna, which did not rot or spoil because they didn't cook it. So it would have been like, dry oatmeal, but they were able to save it and say, remind the people, remember this? This is what it was. This is what we had in the wilderness. So they kept it. And the end of the story says that they ate this manna for 40 years because that's how long they were in the wilderness. And when you get to the end where they come to the Jordan and cross over to go into Jericho, I believe in that story, it says on that day, the manna stopped. So there was provision for them for as long as they were in the wilderness. And then when they entered into the promised land, you don't need manna anymore. So that's the story of the manna. Now, the whole idea of enough and what that means and how we understand that, I think is the whole point of this lesson. So I want to tell you a story about a dream that I had 7 years ago, 2015. And it was a very unusual dream because the first night that I dreamed it, I didn't realize that I only remembered the very end. It wasn't until the next night that I redreamed the first part and realized what it all meant. It was one of those.
I
So
wish you could do that.
Me
How do you
too.
do
I-
that?
No.
I have no idea. I've left the wilderness since then. There wasn't any more manna. So here's the dream. Here's what I remember the first night. My son walks in to the kitchen and takes 2 dimes, a nickel, and 2 pennies. We'll get that later. And throws them down onto the counter. You heard the little sound they make? 27 cents he threw down on the counter. What in the world is going on here? And these coins, they were rough looking. They make this one look really good. I mean, they look like they've been through hell. Not the put them on the railroad track and let the train run over them kind of hell. These were still spendable, but you know, through the coarsest pockets and the roughest places on earth kind of hell that sometimes kids can do with coins. Now, my son will be 30 on
In 2 days.
Saturday. But here in this dream, just 7 years ago, he was much, much younger. He was at that age, I was thinking as I saw him, where truth not only comes out of your mouth naturally, but it also flows from your eyes and your hands, because in some ways, that's all you know. It even comes from your heart without trying. Not that he doesn't tell the truth now, as far as I know, but this was before he learned how the truth opens windows and how doors can be closed by falsehood. If you can't remember that age for yourself or even for children in a younger generation, I thought you should try and find a way to hang out with little people whose truth telling has not been pruned by ego. People who have not yet learned how to calculate their words to get what they want. The simple truth that was reflected in his eyes that day was that he expected this 27 cents to pay for everything. He expected it to change the world. And the counter, I remember that these coins rolled and settled on, was made of white marble that had these strands that looked like caramel stirred through milk on it. We've never had, no, we never had cabinet counters like that. So, you know, that was all just part of the dream. But the coins made a kind of music as they fell and did their little dance before they finally just laid down in silence. So I had no idea what was coming next, but the truth that I could feel coming from his body spoke one message clearly to me. When I wrote the story of this dream, I called it 27 cents. But the message that I heard at the end of that dream was, God is going to do something right before your eyes, whether you're paying attention or not. So you might as well watch. And I thought, that's what the name of this story really should be, but whoever has a name of story that's long. So it stayed 27 cents. So how could anyone expect 5 small coins to change anything? I'll tell you why. It was because it was all he had. And he knew that whatever he had was enough. That's what I felt. So as I wrote the end of that dream, I said, that's the truth for today for you. It's all I have. And I know that whatever I have is enough. Take that with you today. Speak it, if not with your lips, at least with your heart, and into every circumstance of your life. And I woke up. So that was the end of the dream, but I didn't know it was the end of the dream until the next night. And here's the first of the dream. The doorbell rang. I didn't know who it was and what they were selling, but I was ready to tell them to hit the road. The house was a wreck, as if an epic struggle had taken place and no one bothered to straighten up. I turned around and looked before I opened the door. So I unlocked and opened the door. And he just stood there, smiling. No product, no pitch, just a smile. He didn't have a name badge either, but I knew who he was. I knew because I've never been looked at like this before. It wasn't so much being looked at as it was being seen into. Now, I've had people see into me before, but not like this, because most of the time when other people see below the surface, their instinct often is recoil. But no matter what their mouths say, if you look at their eyes, you see retreat often. But not this guy. In fact, it felt like we were falling into one another, like this being seen, this being known, was an invitation for me to cease all my pretending. I could tell it would have been futile to continue. I felt like a lion tamer holding a stake behind my back. There was no pretending. And that's when I started to scramble up here. My litany of if onlys went into overdrive. If only I'd known you were coming today. I could have finished that do-it-yourself den renovation, or at least Jenny could have. And we would have had a lovely place to visit. If only I'd known, I could have read a daily devotional and we could have discussed it, or I could have prepared some Pinterest-worthy hors d'oeuvres to pop out of the oven for us to share. Or I could have prayed the newspaper, cementing my solidarity with all who have the boot of oppression and injustice on their necks. Or at least I could have shaved and put on some decent clothes. I wanted to ask if you'd come back in a few months, or at least tomorrow, so that I could prepare. But your eyes said, today is the day, now is the time. So seeing that you weren't going to give up, I invited you in. And as we slowly walked toward the kitchen, I silently rehearsed all my excuses, kind of like the prodigal son. I'm not worthy to be called your child. I've wasted so much of that which you have gifted me. But before I could squeeze the first phrase from my lips, you grabbed me and hugged me. I felt the waterfall release, first from my own eyes down your back, and then from yours down mine. And I couldn't tell which one of us was holding on more tightly. All I knew was that I never wanted to let go. And through the well of tears, I caught a glimpse of my son at the top of the stairs. He was smiling, and then he turned to go to his room. And a minute or so later, he was bounding down the stairs with one fist clenched. That's how the 2 dimes, 1 nickel, and 2 pennies arrived for their dance on the kitchen counter. There were no words, at least out loud. It was as if our hearts suddenly remembered a language all their own, a language that I couldn't remember ever knowing. And even though my son seemed to know the language, I think there were some things he hadn't yet understood, because even though he was speaking with his heart, the accents of economy and empire were still unmistakable, because he may not have known the word transaction at that age, but he was fully aware of how things worked, or so he thought. But there was no transaction, at least none in which we could play a part. The rhythm of my heart hesitated and fluttered out a new word, not transaction, but transformation. And my son and I tried that word on for size, both of us wallowing around inside of it like children in their parents' dress-up clothes. There was no way we could fill it out, at least not now. But it rested well on us, in spite of its roominess. A larger heart percussed the brief message that vibrated us to the core, that said, it's a gift, this grace. And all you can do is pay it forward with all you have, even if it's only 27 cents at a time. This is the thing that God does every day, right before our eyes, whether we were paying attention or not. So we might as well watch. When we truly practice Sabbath, and when we dare to trust God and pay attention, we will discover that there's enough.
Amen.
That's a lot. Something I'll need to hear about.